So firstly, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role on Jack Reacher?
Well, my name's Henry Jackman, and I was the composer for the score for the movie Jack Reacher Never Go Back, which is the second in the franchise. For those out there who may not know what that means, well, it's funny you mentioned that. I remember talking to a friend of my mother's, right, who doesn't really my mum doesn't have like that much interest in what I do for a living, and she had a friend who, when it was explained to her, oh, so Diane's son, i.e. me, does the music for films. She goes, oh, I thought when you do a movie, the music comes with the film, like the batteries to a toy or something. So for anyone who doesn't know how it works, no, that is not the case. The music obviously does not come with the film. There is a movie, there's sometimes a temp track, and then one spends anything from 3 months to a year writing all the music for the film.
And how does that process work? I mean, do you go like scene by scene? Do you sort of maybe compose pieces just more on like a thematic level first?
That's a really good question. It often depends. Sometimes it's good to, having read the script and having seen the movie, step away from picture. Maybe sometimes just put a still or a series of stills up and write self-contained pieces away from picture to sort of make discoveries. You don't want to spend too long doing that because those ultimately won't be the cues for the film. But it's somewhere in the middle. You neither want to spend too long in a sort of abstract space of writing separate suites away from picture. But on the other hand, if you just launch straight in to the picture and doing specific music to the scenes, you sometimes haven't made all the discoveries you need to make, and you'll end up coming back and revisiting and reworking stuff when it would have been good to be away from picture just to find your colors and your harmonies and your theme and your texture. Because necessarily when you work to picture, because of the not the restrictions, but the what's dictated to you by the mechanics of the scene, you will necessarily have to craft and follow that. And if you're in the early stages of trying to find your motifs and themes, you don't want to be held back by that to start with. You want to let music follow its own sort of self-justifying, route, and it'll lead you to certain discoveries. And I just find you sort of know when that point is. It would be a bit like the difference between, I don't know if you were a chef, rather if there was a really important meal with 10 people showing up, instead of just literally cooking that one meal, you might want to just have a sort of practice run where you just do a couple of roasts to see what's going on, and then you can be extremely specific about who's going to be eating what later. But it's good to be apart from anything else, the other good thing about it is you have a greater sense of freedom for experimentation, because it doesn't matter if some things don't work. So you sometimes end up pursuing a musical thing to its conclusion because it had its own sort of request for internal logic and you followed it. And then it may be something that in the ultimate analysis isn't that useful for the film anyway. But there was no panic about that because you were in this sort of abstract space of trying to find things. Whereas when you're working to picture, if something doesn't work, you're like, why the hell isn't this working? It seems more stressful.
And I would imagine that those sort of themes that don't necessarily make it inform the rest of...
Yes, exactly. That's a very good point. Meaning, in order to know, if you're going for a walk, it could be interesting to know that if you know that path, doesn't go to the river and it starts climbing, that probably means that other one back that we missed last time, that's probably the one that heads south. You discover something by, we've been down that road and we know that doesn't work for this particular movie. That's as valuable. Apart from the else, it's also a good thing when you have nagging doubts. There's nothing more annoying than go, I wonder if it might have been cool had we gone down this road. What happens if we blah, blah, blah. And instead of going, well, I guess we'll never know, that might have been a brilliant idea. So no, I remember, I tried that, it was rubbish. You know what I mean? We've been down that road and it doesn't work. So it is good in the early stages. I always think that you'll end up with something. If you just start writing straight away to picture, you're likely to go for something a little safer, a little more known, and whilst the music and the cues might be well crafted, you're less likely to have made a slightly interesting discovery that can then apply to the whole score. Actually, in the case of Jack Reacher, it was more a case of deconstruction, because I remember having a Samantha theme that even as I'd finished it, I knew it was a little bit on the elaborate side for this particular sort of movie. Jack Reacher is a long way from Harry Potter in sort of symphonic style, and I had a Samantha idea, and I remember playing it to Ed, and we sort of delved into it, just keep scraping away the bits we didn't need till we got it down to these, to use a pretentious poetic term, couplets. You know, these two. It was a little over lyrical in a movie where Samantha's sort of character arc was not Legends of the Fall, or it wasn't some giant romance or anything, and I had a slightly overdeveloped lyrical theme, but it was a really interesting process because, you know, I mean, Ed, you know, he was sort of chipping away at me, and we ended up finding the more tentative, deconstructed version of it. So that's a good example of, you start with something that in that case is a little, it would be like you've got a big hog roast and you got but you don't need all of it, you know, you end up slicing bits off, you know, it's not like everyone has to eat everything.
Did you have any sort of particular goals, maybe personal goals or goals with Ed on what you were trying to achieve with Jack?
Yes, I think so. I think that would be a fair surmise, because I think what's interesting about Ed Zwick, well, as everyone knows, I mean, he's a really established director, but it's not just that he's established. He's established with an unquestionable dramatic integrity. That's what I mean. You know, if you think about some things Ed Zwick's done, I don't know, the last film I saw was Pawn Sacrifice, but I don't know, Last Samurai, Legends of the Fall. There's a if you're going to hire Ed Zwick, you in the bag already coming, you know, with the package is a dramatic sureness of touch. Now, and that's like, well, hold on, because this is Jack Reacher, so Jack Reacher's obviously going to have action and espionage and, you know, all the sorts of things you associate with it. But actually, in this particular movie, as well as that, I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong. If you made a movie that's an action film and it's tightly put together and has a sort of aspect of thriller to it, that's a genre that works. But what I liked about this story, which you know, Ed was also involved in the writing, is as well as the things you expect from a Jack Reacher movie, there's a dramatic element in it, which is great for the composer, and I think it's great for the movie. I mean, I don't know, people are so familiar with all of Tom Cruise's achievements in the action genre. I mean, it is endless. It goes back to, you know, Top Gun. And sometimes people forget that this is the same guy, Jerry Maguire, Magnolia, Born on the 4th of July. I mean, we're talking about, the man's got some serious dramatic chops. It's just you don't always need them if you're hanging off the side of an airplane in an action film. And what's great about this film is you still get the action hero, but because of the other story in the film with Samantha, it's an opportunity for everyone. The writers of the movie, Tom Cruise, that there's a type of dramatic acting in there. And for me as the composer, it opens up this musical avenue so that you can have a bit of counterpoint in the score. So on the one hand, there is some really pulsating action music, and there's the sort of tension music you'd expect to get in an espionage thriller type movie. But then there's this whole other storyline about Samantha. I can't give too much away about the story, but there's an empathetic and dramatic storyline that I think hugely enriches the film and is great for me as a composer, because you get this whole other strand where the onus isn't on adrenaline and sort of keeping people on the edge of their seats. It's more expressive, and I think Ed did a great job with that. And he saw it through, because, you know, he was part of the writing process, and as a director, that's very much within his grasp. I mean, there's certain directors who are known for doing like amazing action sequences who perhaps would be a bit less comfortable with handling how to kind of sneak the drama in there. But I think he managed to sort of keep it all boiling at the same time, which is great. Meaning you don't expect, the one way I'd sum it up, when I first saw the preview, I was really surprised that the thing I remembered most is I really teared up at the end, which is probably what you'd expect if, I don't know, I mean, every Disney movie, they get you somewhere, don't they? I mean, at the beginning of Up or in the Big Hero 6 I did, there's always a moment where you better get ready because they're going to hit you with something where you start tearing up. It's probably not the first thing you expect from a Jack Reacher movie, but watch out would be my advice, because you may find yourself tearing up in it.
So you've worked on lots of different films that are in that sort of action genre wheelhouse, you know, from Captain America to Kingsman, and then Kong Skull Island is coming out.
Yeah, don't forget The Birth of a Nation, though. Because I don't, when people go, oh yeah, he does action films, and be like,
Right, and I guess for this piece in particular,
Yeah,
like we kind
no,
of
fair
want to
enough,
focus on
fair
that
enough.
a little bit. But what is it about those films that sort of like maybe attract you to the project, or vice versa? What is it about your sort of talent and the way you compose music that
Well,
lends itself to these kinds of films?
Right, so with Captain America, if you take, for example, Captain America, either the second or the third one, I think what's appealing from a film composer point of view is there are many things you could think of, whether it be TV or more intimate film projects, where you've got to keep a pretty low profile. And actually, that's a good thing in itself. And I don't know, I recently did The Birth of a Nation, which is a very different kind of score to the sorts of things we're talking about. But I would say the benefit of some of these big screen, big action things is it's always encouraged to be sort of ambitious, as it were. I mean, I'll give you a good example. At the end of Captain America 3, there's a pretty serious fight going on at the end. And it's a sort of internal fight. It's not one of those giant, 50,000 orcs versus a load of horsemen. It's between Iron Man, Winter Soldier and Captain America. And it's sort of almost a bit Mount Olympus. It's a bit like Zeus versus, it's almost like the Roman gods are having a big old scrap on the top of the mountain kind of thing. And so you get to write, my pitch to the Russos was like, surely, instead of this just being, just pumping adrenaline action music, this is opera, isn't it? Aren't I allowed to kind of, I don't know, I can't remember what the CD track's called. It's called Clash or something. Wouldn't this be the moment where I'm allowed to get pretty operatic about this fight? Because it's not regular. It's not three people having a scrap in a bar where the music I wrote for that scene would be vastly pretentious and pompous. So why am I hearing this sort of huge operatic piece with three men having a brawl in a bar? But if it's a superhero movie, having a titanic fight between these sort of totemic superheroes means that you are allowed to use quite grandiose musical language, which in all frankness, I don't know where else he would use. If you've had a musical education that does include sort of Strauss and Mahler and opera and all the rest of it, you don't really need that in any sort of pop music. You certainly wouldn't need that in a kind of modern TV show. Like, where are the outlets for sort of grand symphonic music? Well, the finale of Captain America would be a good example of one. So you get to do things that I'm trying to think where else you would do them. If you're a frustrated symphonic, in a world where not everyone wants big symphonic music kind of thing, and why should they? There's all sorts of brilliant film scores that are a million miles away from big symphonic stuff, and in fact I've done some of those myself. Having said that, if it weren't for, say, the genre of superhero movies, and just films in general, I'm not sure where that would find an outlet.
What's so, I was going to use a word to describe that Captain America scene, because it's so...
You mean that climax?
Yeah, because the stakes are so high.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But not only are the stakes high, it's not psychologically realistic. You can have a scene like in a Michael Mann movie where the stakes are really high and three people might end up in a fight, and you can't do a cue like I did in Captain America. It's like, why am I hearing this grand, what are they, gods or something? This is ridiculous. Because, it's set in contemporary Los Angeles, but when the setting is not regular, and these are, that's kind of secretly why I like superheroes in a way, because this is going to sound really pretentious, but for whatever reason, in 19th century Germany, the reason why, and by the way, I'm not comparing myself to real composers like Strauss, I'm just talking about a cultural thing. For whatever reason, it was de rigueur and quite a normal thing for composers to write these grand tone poems called things like Ein Heldenleben or Also sprach Zarathustra, and that was like the culture. And for whatever reason, German middle-class people would listen to that. And so it was an accepted thing that people would write these huge, grandiose symphonic pieces that would be listened to in concerts. Well, I don't think you're going to get a record deal these days where, I was thinking of writing a grand 62-minute work called The Hero. And it would be, it'd be like, well, I'm not signing it, mate. Whereas that finds a home, funnily enough, some of the obvious lineage for that type of writing is obviously not as good. Composition as Strauss, but the type of just to wind back, what I'm really saying is, weirdly enough, having superheroes opens the gate to that kind of symphonic writing, because superheroes aren't normal people. you are allowed a more elevated symphonic language that makes sense, instead of people thinking, God, this is pretentious and ridiculous, as it would if you try to put it in Syriana or something like realistic or modern. The whole genre of the superhero, when you've got a titanic clash between sort of Captain America and Iron Man, and it's about whether the whole idea of a superhero should or shouldn't be accountable to human society in general, and like these are all such kind of elevated ideas that don't happen on a Monday morning in most people's regular lives, that it asks for a type of symphonic language which sort of harks back a bit to these big, Austro-Germanic composers. So I'm nowhere near as good as any of them. I'm just saying it's the only time you can steal some stuff from there and put it in movies, and it works in a way that just wouldn't. I mean, Jack Reacher, if you try to do that would be completely the wrong approach.
Right. So at IMAX, we talk often about sort of like the movie-going experience being visceral and immersive. How do you think the soundtrack and the composition of the music lends itself to adding to that effect when people go see a movie?
Well,
in IMAX.
The funny thing, I'd almost be tempted to think of it the other way around. Often when you're working on writing the music, you're not in an IMAX cinema. There you usually, I got a home studio. It's got a pretty decent screen, and you can sometimes you often have to remember the extra perspective that happens once you get into a serious. Once your listening and viewing arena is for real and it's an IMAX screen and you're actually at the cinema, you mustn't forget that, because often you'll be working day by day by day and you're not in that environment, and it does make a difference. And it makes a difference to, as a composer, sometimes to the level of ambition you might have about something, because you might be working on something going, well, I maybe should, I don't know if this scene necessarily merits this level of heightened tension or this level of emotional depth, because there you are staring at a screen looking like this, and then sometimes I'll go to a preview which that's not even IMAX, it's just a regular screen, and go, oh wow, what was I thinking? This is a really big deal, this scene. It's a different experience. Now I'm seeing it all. So funnily enough, the intended, you should always keep an eye on the intended, that's not to say everyone watches that, because loads of people watching on planes and laptops and these days iPhones. But it does make a huge difference, and it also affects how you mix things at the dub. The having the fullest expanse, both of screen and these days with Atmos as well, means I think it means you pay a little more attention. You've got more to play with. You can move. I mean, even just on a technical level. I mean, when you deliver mixes to the dub stage these days, it's in so many bits now because you can put it in so many different places. But I think leaving IMAX aside for a second, the experience should always be one, hopefully, that the audience don't notice. You know what I mean? And I feel like with IMAX, I've got even more room to be manipulative in a funny way, because it's so visually spectacular. I mean, in a way, it goes back to like the biggest compliment, annoyingly, in a way, for film composers. Like, oh yeah, the music. I didn't think about it. I mean, not quite, but at least you haven't jolted people out of the narrative. You were enhancing it sufficiently, hopefully, throughout, that no one had that experience. I feel like IMAX is even more immersive. So you really got to commit a crime musically to pull people out of the visual narrative and the dialogue. You're going to have to commit a sin of pretty epic proportions for people to be, sitting in front of something that visually magnificent and then be dislocated and distracted, unless on those few occasions when you are called upon deliberately to unsettle and dislocate people. But it just makes it's just an added level of immersion, really, that I welcome. If only everyone watched it, I'd much rather everyone watch things on IMAX rather than iPhones and the backs of airplane seats.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about how, when you watch a film on IMAX, it's what the filmmakers intended.
Right. And you do know, you often happens is you notice some details. I mean, even just in I mean, IMAX, it's not exactly linked, but I mean, it tends to be the case that IMAX cinemas do not have lousy sound systems. You know what I mean? And you even start to notice, I mean, not everyone's a complete audio geek, but I don't think you have to be. Without knowing why you're noticing different things, I even feel like just the nuances of people's delivery make things clearer and make things, you may even pick up on what a lot of people, obviously when a screen's that big, a movie feels very visual and it feels like a person's acting is very visual. And as long as you're hearing the dialogue and you understand what it means. But don't forget, so much of, in addition to seeing all the detail of people's expressions and little subtle things that might be happening that you didn't quite notice before, even also with the sound, when the sound's that much better as well, you'll get little nuances in people's dialogue performance where they're just, you hear the sarcasm a little bit more, you hear, you know, and especially with, you know, close-up shots and whatnot, you get so much acting in facial expression that you could literally not even pick up on if it's on a laptop or something. And you know who it really affects is actors. I mean, if you're overacting, you are going to get seriously found out in IMAX, whereas the slightest little facial gesture, you know, is a big deal. You know, a close-up shot in IMAX is, you could probably do most of what you need to achieve with your nostrils. You know what I mean?
Or like a twitch with your eye or something. Yeah,
exactly.
So with Jack Reacher, why do you think this movie merits going to see it in IMAX?
Well, I would, well, first of all, it looks, there's a certain, I don't know how to describe it. I'm not really an expert on cinematographical adjectives. It's got, well, firstly, why wouldn't you, right? But secondly, there's sort of two things about it that I think are interesting. One is there's a sort of earthy classiness to it that, I don't know why that would particularly merit the scale and the size, but I would rather see it like that. And secondly, there's a viscera in the action and the movement. There's a lot of people fleeing and being chased in this film, and I feel like that the scale of that is in its correct context, you know, with a huge screen like that.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about sort of like in that vein of the visceralness and the
Yeah.
immersiveness that it lends itself, but also with the sound, there's the high, powerful dynamic range also.
Oh, yeah.
That,
Well, that's, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I love about film music is, unlike the record industry, where everyone is spending all their time trying to make everything kind of dynamically level and max out as loud as possible all the time. The great thing about movies is kind of the opposite. You'll have everything in movies from like the quietest, stillest moment and then a massive crescendo, and you have this huge dynamic range, which puts an onus on the system that you're listening to. The better the system, the more, it's like a symphony orchestra can go from, you know, just a flute and the tiniest pianissimo timp to like full tutti orchestra. And that sounds fantastic. When you're in the Walt Disney Concert Hall, that having the capacity to have such an amazing dynamic range is what is part of the experience. And so that's great. In a decent cinema and a, you know, IMAX screen, you'll get all of that. I mean, I remember writing cues where just before the action kicks off, it's sort of tailing down, and it's like pianissimo. It's the sort of level where in 1972 you might even be into sort of tape hiss by this point. You know, you'll start to hear this, and then it all kicks off. And, you know, all the gags, like the lull before the storm and the kind of the misdirect, and then the action kicks off, all of those kind of things. Having the correct or the most elevated reproduction system, whether it's visual or audio, just means that all of these things that you're, you know, manipulating the audience with will like deliver like crazy, because it's the best tools to play it back on, you know.
Absolutely. Were there any particular challenges that maybe Ed posed or that the film itself posed when you went in to create the composition?
No, it was a pretty smooth ride, because Ed and I had, you know, we were very creatively in sync. I think, if anything, I think that very opening cue was a teaser, was a tester, because it was an interesting way around. When I first wrote the opening cue, it was somewhat neutral. It was a little bit procedural, and then by the time I got to the end of the movie, I then wrote this extremely emotional piece for the end. And I was like, well, is there any way? Clearly, it can't be as emotionally resolved as that, because that's the end of the movie. But there's something about the beginning of the movie where he's trying to connect, even though he's very sort of emotionally detached, that the opening scene just has little suggestions of him trying to reach out. And so there was well, maybe there's a universe where there is something emotional about the first cue. And it took a while because then I wrote one that was like way too emotional. It's like, okay, no, well that's not it. It's somewhere between a kind of thriller stroke action neutrality on the one hand and this other thing which feels too emotionally developed. It's promised too much when we don't really know all of the characters of the film. There's something about here that hasn't been written yet. So finding that was an interesting one, but I'm very proud I eventually found it. I think that was the challenge though.
And then sort of switching topics a little bit, for aspiring composers or, fans of mixing or sound in general for films, what are some of, tips or advice that you want to give them when they're trying to enter the industry?
Wow. Well, I would, in a sort of platonic universe, the most important thing is composition and ideas. And I still think that is true. The only thing I would say is, it being 2016, people need to hear things before they're finished, before they're mixed, before it has a real orchestra on it. So actually, there are so many, unlike, say, 1950, where as long as you have a piece of manuscript paper and a pencil, a director with imagination, a piano, some trust and a conversation, the next time you might hear it might be at the scoring stage. Those days are gone. So they're going to hear everything. So having a quite extensive set of what you might consider technical skills, programming symphony orchestra to sound like a symphony orchestra, being good at mix, if you want to do hybrid movies, really knowing what you're doing with electronica and being able to put everything together and balance it and all the rest of it. You would think that, oh, well, this is all technical, is it? Well, you say that, other than if you have a meeting, scenario A, so imagine the idea of the piece is pretty much the same thing. Scenario A over here, poorly programmed orchestra with bad samples, with slightly badly put together electronica mixed poorly, will produce the following reaction. Yeah, no, I don't think this isn't really working. Scenario B, pretty much the same compositional idea, all done, executed properly. Oh, this is fantastic. Yeah, I like this. This is great. And that isn't, so in 2016, you sort of need both. Now, that's not to say that the danger with that is that you can end up with people who can advance quite a long way in their career who are able to make things sound rather good. But if you scrape away under the bonnet in terms of actual composition, there's not really much there, but it's presentationally is fantastic. In an ideal world, both are happening at the same time. And if you're going to go outside of just the symphony orchestra, then a lot of these skills, because ultimately mocking up an orchestra is one thing, because eventually it gets played anyway, so it's going to be real. But if it's not orchestral, then all these things are for real. That's what you're going to hear in the cinema. All the textual, it's not like, oh, well, we're just sort of messing around with it because it's going to be done, properly later. This is it. Whatever the textual stuff you're working on that is not acoustic is what millions of people are going to hear in the cinema. So it can't be lame.
Right, exactly.
So I would say ultimately the most important thing about being a film composer is really, it's almost in a funny way, it's literary criticism skills. It's understanding a story, breaking it down and being able to come up with ideas that enhance the story. That's in some sort of abstract area of intellectual, but that's the most important thing. Then once you start implementing, then a lot of these skills are really important. You could easily imagine a scenario where someone who is in fact very gifted but lacking many skills to make it able to be presented. Unfortunately, imagination for sound has gone down a bit since we're all able to make things sound pretty damn good before. Right, so these days, when people hear things, you put spacebar in Pro Tools, and it's pretty much like, what I'm hearing is what I'm reacting to. I'm not projecting something I might be hearing in the future. Just play it to me now, and what I'm hearing is what I'll react to. So it would be, for anyone who is potentially very skillful composer who's thinking, oh, I'm not going to bother with any technical. Well, that's fine. If you want to be like a concert composer and everything's manuscript paper and you can get some guys to program stuff up. But if you want to do some work in the industry that's going to be with TV and film and video games and whatnot, it would be a real shame if you do have compositional talent to be held back because you don't. In other words, if you're sitting on the fence with, oh, shall I do this like mixing course because I don't really want to, or shall I, figure out how to use Logic or Cubase? Well, the answer is yes, you should.
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely the kind of advice for people.
Yeah, that's not to say it's the most important thing, because on the other hand, I hear too much of it, something that's presentationally it's well engineered, well mixed, all the rest of it. But there's
no life to it.
yeah, if you actually go to a piano and go, well, what composition-wise, what's happening here? Like, not very much, you know. So ideally, both.
I mean, and that problem doesn't just exist in film and TV.
No, it's right.
It's
but
certainly in music.
Exactly.
So IMAX itself is coming up on its 50th anniversary.
Oh wow.
And
That surprises me, actually.
They've definitely done a lot to sort of change the industry in a lot of ways. You know, about 15 years ago, we started projecting Hollywood films and, you know, in movie theaters, whereas before it was mainly these, like, you know, documentary films that we were showing in institutional
Space
theaters.
or National Geographic.
Yeah. So, you know, how has that sort of, over those decades, changed audiences' experiences of film?
Well, that's an interesting question.
And I think it also goes back to a question about you, like why do you like to go see IMAX movies?
That I think it, but well, it's what's interesting about that is, I guess, I mean, the history and origin of IMAX is that you would see these often, you know, things from the natural world or from space or something. So the idea being, because we've got these incredible dimensions to play with, it's mostly been things that are purely visually spectacular. Why I think it's great that the transition was made to, you know, big films going to IMAX. It's like, well, hold on a minute, just things can be both visually spectacular and also, bonus, have a really good story. So if anything, I mean, the ultimate use of IMAX would be that, where you're killing two birds with one stone. I mean, it's great. I mean, I don't know, let's think of something like Ridley Scott. There's a good example. Ridley Scott movies, you know, you could just switch them off and let them run in the background, and they're all, I mean, it's like a moving painting. I mean, I'm sure some people have Ridley Scott movies they prefer to others, but you'll never be able to say they don't look good. You know, I think all of his movies are great, right? But they're inherently, it's part of his style. He's a very visual, I mean, go look at Blade Runner and Alien. All of these movies are visually spectacular, but they're not just to stare at. You know, at the same time, Alien is just like, you can hardly bear the tension, and it's an amazing story as well. So why wouldn't you, if a nature documentary is allowed to be, you know, on IMAX, I would say that something like Alien would be, you know, twice as worthy of being, you know, of being viewed in an IMAX situation, because you're getting, I think it comes back to what we were talking about before about the story, because it's not just a canvas, like a painting, it's an environment where a story is being told. Only guess what? Now we've got like the biggest version, so the visual aspect of it will be the most spectacular. But what's great about movies is you know, it's almost like that. And if you go back thousands of years, it's like it's the bard telling the stories by the fire. Only it's like the most technologically advanced version where it looks absolutely incredible. But you know, if you can have a documentary, then I think triple times that you can have, you know, you can have a movie, because you get, you know, story plus spectacle equals